Captain Ethan Walker snatched the manifest out of the briefing and coordinator's hands, scanned it once, then burst out laughing, loud enough for the entire room to stop what they were doing. He held up the paper like it was a punchline. "Ghost Rider," he announced, grinning at the 30 pilots standing around him. They gave a civilian performer the call sign Ghost Rider. He looked directly at the woman in the corner, quiet still holding a worn leather flight bag, and laughed again. Nobody stopped him, and she didn't say a single word. If that moment made your blood boil even a little, stay right here. Hit that subscribe button, drop a comment telling me what city you are watching from, because I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The morning started the way most mornings at Red Valley Air Force Base started, with noise. Not the noise of engines or aircraft. The noise of men who believed they already knew everything worth knowing. 32 of the best young fighter pilots in the United States. Military had gathered in Hangar 7 for the pre-event briefing of the Red Valley Aviation Showcase. This was not a small event. This was the kind of event that decided careers, shaped reputations, and separated pilots who were good from pilots who were genuinely exceptional. Generals flew in from 3 different commands. Aviation journalists set up cameras along the perimeter fence. Defense contractors arranged private viewing boxes along the East Ridge. And somewhere in Washington, people with serious titles on their office doors were paying close attention to who performed well and who didn't. The stakes were real, the pressure was real, and the pride in that hangar was so thick you could have cut it with a blade. Captain Ethan Walker stood near the center of the briefing room with the natural ease of a man who had grown comfortable being noticed. He was 34 years old, broad-shouldered, with the kind of jawline that looks good in promotional photographs, and the kind of confidence that fills a room before you even open your mouth. His record was genuinely impressive, nobody disputed that. 280 hours in the F-35, multiple awards for precision flying, 2 commendations for airmanship under pressure. He had earned his reputation the right way, and he knew it, and he made sure everyone around him knew it too. He had a way of talking that made everything sound like a joke, but the kind of joke where he was always right and you were always the one laughing along because disagreeing felt like too much effort. Lieutenant Noah Bennett, 26, stood to Ethan's left and followed his lead, the way younger pilots always followed the lead of the man who seemed most certain of himself. Noah was talented, genuinely talented, but he was at the age where talent alone doesn't tell you how much you still have to learn. The rest of the group fell along a spectrum between those two, some quieter, some louder, some watching the room, some talking over it. Then the side door opened, and Claire Morgan walked in. She did not make an entrance. That was the first thing people noticed about her, and it was the thing some of them would remember longest. She walked into a room full of the nation's best fighter pilots, with the same energy she might have used to walk into a grocery store. No posture designed to impress. No pause at the threshold. She simply came in, found an open space near the back left wall, set her old leather flight bag on the floor beside her, and folded her hands together in front of her body. She was 39 years old, though the lines around her eyes made her look older to people who judge quickly and younger to people who look carefully. She wore a plain dark jacket, practical boots, and no military insignia of any kind because she wasn't military. She was listed on the event manifest as a civilian aviation performer, a category that placed her in the minds of the men in that room somewhere between a curiosity and an afterthought. Her aircraft was already on the tarmac, a restored machine from another generation. Not an F-35, not anything close to the hardware the military pilots would be flying. Several of the younger pilots had walked past it on the way in and made comments ranging from classic to museum piece to things less kind than either of those. Nobody introduced her. Nobody made space for her near the front. She didn't ask for either. The briefing coordinator specialist, Lena Torres, moved through the agenda with practiced efficiency, weather conditions, airspace corridors, sequencing for the afternoon demonstration flights, emergency frequencies, and procedures. Standard material delivered quickly for people who already knew most of it. It was during the manifest review that it happened. Lena read through the call signs in sequence. The military pilots had their standard designations. Walker was Viper 1, Bennett was Shadow 2, and down the list it went clean and professional and expected. Then Lena read the civilian entry. Civilian demonstration, restored aircraft. Performer designation. She paused for half a second, not because she was uncertain, but because the name seemed to require a small breath around it. Ghostwriter. The room didn't react immediately. There was a half second where the name just sat in the air unexamined. Then Ethan Walker laughed. It wasn't a small laugh. It wasn't the polite chuckle of someone who found something mildly amusing. It was a full, loud, genuine burst of laughter that filled the space and gave everyone else in the room permission to decide how they felt. He grabbed the manifest printout from the table in front of him, held it up, and turned to face the room with the expression of someone who had just found the best joke of the week. Ghost Rider, he said again, letting the name roll out slowly, deliberately, like he was savoring it. They actually gave a civilian performer the call sign Ghost Rider. He shook his head, still grinning. What is this, a comic book, a movie Ghost Rider? He looked around the room. Come on, somebody explain this to me. A few pilots laughed. Some smiled out of social reflex. A few said nothing and watched. Ethan turned, and his eyes found Claire in the back corner of the room. He looked at her the way someone looks at a misplaced object, not with hostility exactly, but with the specific kind of dismissal that is in some ways worse than hostility. At least hostility acknowledges that a person matters enough to oppose. What Ethan offered Claire in that moment was something smaller than that. He looked at her like she was simply in the wrong place. No offense, he said with the tone of someone who absolutely intended to give offense. But that call sign has some history attached to it. Real history, military history, you know what I mean. Claire looked at him. She did not look away. She did not look down. She did not smile to make him comfortable or flinch to satisfy whatever he was looking for. She simply held his gaze with a steadiness that was not aggressive, but was also entirely immovable. She said nothing. Ethan waited for a moment, and when nothing came, he turned back to the room and shrugged with theatrical ease. Just saying, some call signs need to be earned. Noah Bennett nodded. Two other pilots chuckled. A few more said nothing, but their silence was the kind of silence that goes along with the loudest voice in the room rather than the kind that pushes back. Lena Torres looked briefly in Claire's direction with an expression that might have been an apology, then moved on with the briefing. Claire did not change her expression. She reached into the side pocket of her old flight bag, pulled out a small, worn notebook, and made a quiet notation in it. No one could see what she wrote. No one tried to find out. The briefing continued, but something had shifted invisibly in the way that important things sometimes shift before anyone is ready to name them. After the formal briefing ended, and the group broke into smaller conversations, Claire moved toward the exit with the same unhurried efficiency she'd entered with. She had what she needed: the weather data, the airspace corridors, the timing sequences. She didn't need small talk. She didn't need to be welcomed. She had work to do. It was at the door that Master Sergeant Daniel Hayes stopped her. Hayes was the chief ground mechanic for the event, a broad-weathered man in his late 40s with hands that looked like they'd spent 30 years inside engine compartments because they had. He was not a man who wasted words or gestures, and he crossed the floor with deliberate purpose. "Ms. Morgan," he said. She turned. "Your aircraft," he said. "I ran the pre-check this morning." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "Who told you about the fuel line dampener on the left manifold?" Claire tilted her head slightly. "Nobody told me. I felt it when I walked the aircraft yesterday afternoon. Slight vibration pattern. Subtle, but it was there." Hayes stared at her for a moment. "My team didn't catch it," he said. "Took us 2 hours to confirm what you already knew." "Your team is excellent," she said without flattery or condescension. "It's an unusual pattern, easy to read it as normal resonance." Hayes studied her face, not the way men sometimes studied her face in rooms like this one with doubt or dismissal. He studied her the way a craftsman studies the work of another craftsman, trying to understand the method behind it. "What kind of flying did you say you did before the civilian circuit?" he asked. "I didn't say," she answered, and she walked out. Hayes stood at the doorway for a moment, watching the direction she'd gone. Then he turned around and walked back toward the flight line with something different on his face, not quite concern, but the particular alertness of a man who has just realized he may be dealing with someone considerably more significant than the paperwork suggested. Outside, the Nevada morning was already sharp with heat and light. The tarmac stretched wide and flat, and aircraft were being positioned along the demonstration corridor with the careful geometry of a military operation. Ethan Walker stood near the F-35 staging area with 3 other pilots reviewing flight sequences, on a tablet pointing at the screen, laughing at something someone said. Claire walked past without looking toward them. She walked directly to her aircraft. To anyone watching casually, what followed would have looked like a routine pre-flight inspection, the kind of check any pilot does before getting into a cockpit. Walk the airframe, confirm surfaces, check the gear, verify fuel, standard procedure. But it wasn't standard, not the way she did it. She moved around that aircraft the way a surgeon moves before an operation. Not rushing, not performing, but with an economy of attention that absorbed everything and wasted nothing. She ran her fingertips along the wing root junction at an angle that wasn't in any standard checklist. She crouched beside the landing gear and listened to something literally press the side of her head close and listened for almost 45 seconds. She climbed onto the upper wing surface and checked 3 separate structural points that weren't on the routine inspection form for that airframe type. 2 of Hayes's mechanics were nearby double-checking their own work on the adjacent staging area. They watched her without speaking. Then one of them, Airman First Class Reyes, 22 years old, and in his second year of duty, turned to the other and said very quietly, "She checked the forward spar point." The other mechanic, a 25-year-old named Caldwell, nodded slowly. "Yeah, how did she know?" Reyes didn't have an answer. That structural point had been the subject of an engineering advisory notice for that airframe type issued 18 months earlier. The notice was not widely circulated. It required knowing that the aircraft had a specific manufacturing run number in a particular production year, cross-referencing that against flight hours and understanding a stress pattern that had only shown up in a handful of real-world cases. Claire had gone directly to it without hesitation. Nobody asked her about it. Nobody stopped her to demand an explanation. But the 2 mechanics exchanged a look that carried a great deal of unspoken weight, and they both quietly went back and rechecked their own work on the adjacent aircraft. Inside the main operations center, Sergeant Major Robert Collins stood over a desk covered in the day's operational documents. Collins was 61 years old, thick through the chest, with silver hair cut close, and a presence that military personnel of lower rank instinctively moved around rather than through. He had spent 37 years in aviation command, as a crew chief, as an operations manager, as a senior field commander in deployments that most people in that hangar had only read about in training materials. And it was reviewing the afternoon flight sequence when his Deputy Lieutenant Colonel Maurice Santos placed the updated manifest on the desk in front of him. "Updated call sign registry for the civilian demonstration," Santos said. Collins picked it up without urgency, ran his eyes down the list, stopped. His hand went very still. Santos noticed because she noticed everything. "Sir." Collins didn't answer immediately. He looked at the name Claire Morgan, civilian demonstration performer, ghostwriter, and he held it the way a person holds something they weren't sure they'd ever see again. "Collins," Santos said more carefully this time. "Do you know her?" He set the paper down slowly and looked out through the operations center window toward the flight line. "Get me her full aircraft authorization documentation," he said. "We have the standard civilian performance clearance." "Not that," he said. "The other documentation." "The full record. All of it." Santos looked at him for a moment. "That's going to require a Class C authorization request through." "I know what it requires," Collins said. His voice was quiet but carried no room for discussion. "Do it." Santos left. Collins remained at the window looking out at the flight line, and his expression was not one of recognition. Exactly. It was something closer to the feeling of standing at a distance from something enormous and trying to understand its full shape. He knew that name. He knew that call sign. And if he was right, if the woman on that flight line was who he believed she might be, then the men in that briefing room had made a mistake so profound they didn't yet have the vocabulary to understand its scale. He picked up his radio and had made a quiet, specific request to one of his senior operations coordinators. What he was asking for would take time. He was willing to wait. Back on the flight line, Ethan Walker had finished his tablet review and was walking toward the fuel staging area when he passed close enough to Claire's aircraft to stop. He stood there for a moment, arms folded, looking at the aircraft with the particular expression of a man who has already decided what he thinks but wants one more moment to confirm it. The aircraft was not ugly. It had the kind of structural elegance that comes from functional design rather than aesthetic intention. But it was old and its age was visible, and to Ethan's eye it looked like everything the modern fighter jet world had left behind. He looked from the aircraft to Claire, who was on the other side of the wing, making a note in her small book. "That's a brave choice," he said. She looked up. "Flying that today," he said, nodding toward the aircraft, "with the hardware that's going to be in the air alongside it." He paused. "How long have you been doing the civilian performance circuit?" "Long enough," she said. "What did you fly before?" he asked. "Before the shows." She looked at him for a moment with the same unwavering steadiness she'd had in the briefing room. "Aircraft," she said. Ethan blinked. Then he laughed, a smaller, more uncertain laugh than the one in the briefing room. "Right," he said. "Okay." He looked at the aircraft again. "Well, good luck out there." The tone made it clear he felt luck was exactly what she would need. She had already returned her attention to her notebook before he finished the sentence. He walked away with the faint, prickling sensation of a man whose joke didn't land the way he expected it to, not because it wasn't delivered correctly, but because the person he directed it at simply hadn't registered it as worth responding to. It was a small feeling, barely noticeable, and he shook it off before he reached the fuel staging area. But it stayed with him in the way small things sometimes do, not loudly but persistently. Lieutenant Noah Bennett found him at the fuel station a few minutes later, tablet in hand, looking slightly less certain than usual. "Hey," Noah said, "did you know the civilian cleared the left manifold dampener issue before Hayes's crew did?" "Who did?" Ethan looked at him. "What? On her aircraft. There was a fuel line issue. Hayes said she identified it yesterday during her walk-around. His team confirmed it this morning." Noah paused. It wasn't on the standard checklist. Ethan stared at his tablet for a moment. "Good for her," he said. "She's been flying that airframe for years. She'd know its quirks." "Yeah," Noah said. "Probably." He looked back in the direction of Claire's aircraft. "She checked the forward spar point too. Reyes said she went right to it." Ethan glanced up. "The structural advisory notice." "Yeah." There was a pause. "That notice wasn't widely distributed," Ethan said. "No." Noah agreed. "It wasn't." Another pause. "How would she know about that?" Ethan asked. Noah didn't answer because he didn't have one. Ethan looked down at his tablet and scrolled through his own flight sequence notes with deliberate focus, the way a person scrolls when they want to appear occupied rather than unsettled. "She's been around a long time," he said finally. "You pick things up." Noah nodded and walked away. Ethan stood at the fuel station alone for a moment longer than he needed to. In the operations center, the documentation Collins had requested arrived in 3 sections delivered by a junior officer who placed the folders on the desk without comment and left quickly. Collins opened the first folder. He read slowly. The room around him continued its ordinary noise: radio traffic, keyboard sounds, conversation at adjacent workstations. None of it reached him. He was somewhere else entirely. The first section of the documentation was standard performer records, aircraft certifications, maintenance logs for the restored aircraft event clearances going back 8 years. These were exactly what they appeared to be, and they were exactly what anyone in that operations center could have pulled up in 4 minutes. But it was what came before those 8 years that Collins had been waiting for. The second folder was thicker. Its cover had classification markers that were no longer active. They had been declassified on a rolling schedule, but the markings still carried the particular weight of documents that had once required specific clearances to open. Collins opened it. He found a service record. It was not a civilian service record. He turned pages with the careful, deliberate movements of someone who already suspected what they were going to find, but needed to hold the confirmation in their hands to believe it fully. The name was there. The call sign was there. And the operational record that followed it covered 11 years of flight deployments across 5 different theaters and aircraft that the woman on the flight line was not supposed to have any documented connection to. The record had been carefully structured, legally, properly, professionally, to be separated from her public identity. Not hidden, not erased, separated. There was a distinction, and Collins understood it precisely. She had not run from her record. She had simply never attached it to her name in spaces where it could be used to define her before people had a chance to form their own judgments. Collins turned to the third folder. It was thinner. It contained a single after-action report. I didn't need to read all of it. He had read parts of it before a long time ago, in a different context, when the names in the document had been different, and the specific pilot involved had been listed only by call sign, Ghostwriter. Collins sat back in his chair. For a long moment, he looked at the ceiling of the operations center, at the industrial lighting fixtures and the cable trays, and the acoustic ceiling tiles, and he allowed himself to feel something he didn't often allow himself to feel in a professional setting. The man who had laughed at her name in that briefing room had no idea. The young pilots who had smiled along with him had no idea. And in a few hours, when the aircraft went up, they were going to find out, not all at once, and not in the way that announcements work, but in the slower, more undeniable way that truth always finds its moment. Collins picked up his radio. "This is Collins," he said. "I need someone to quietly confirm the civilian demonstration is in the second position of the afternoon sequence, not the first." The radio crackled. "Copy, Sergeant Major. Confirming. Civilian demonstration is currently listed third in afternoon sequence." Collins thought for a moment. "Move it to second," he said, "and don't announce the change until 1 hour before." A brief pause. "Copy that, sir." He set the radio down. He didn't move the timing because he wanted to give Claire an advantage or set up a spectacle. He moved it because he wanted the young pilots in that hangar to have as clear a view as possible when she went up. Some lessons he had learned needed to be seen in a specific order to land properly. Outside, the morning was shifting into midday. The Nevada heat built steadily and without mercy, and the flight line shimmered at its edges, with the particular distortion that desert air creates when it rises off hot tarmac. Pilots moved between aircraft and briefing areas. Ground crews ran final equipment checks. The cameras along the perimeter fence began recording establishing shots. Inside Hangar 7, the informal group that had gathered around Ethan Walker after the briefing had grown slightly. 3 additional pilots who had arrived late to the morning session had been filled in on the ghostwriter moment by 2 of the pilots who had been there, and the story had been improved in the retelling, as stories always are, until Ethan's laugh had become the natural, uncontroversial response of a room full of professionals to a piece of administrative absurdity. "It's not about her," said one of the pilots, a woman named Captain Daria Morse, who had laughed in the briefing room, but now spoke with the measured tone of someone wanting to appear fair. "It's about the call sign. That name carries specific weight in military aviation. You don't just hand it to a civilian performer." "Exactly," said Ethan. "It's not personal, it's about standards." "Right," said Noah, but he said it less certainly than he might have that morning. In the equipment staging area behind Hangar 7, Claire sat alone on a metal equipment case, her flight bag between her feet, her notebook open on her knee. She was writing steadily, not notes exactly, but something more personal than notes. Her handwriting was small and deliberate, the kind of handwriting that takes up very little space on a page. She had heard from people she trusted that the event today carried significant professional weight for many of the pilots involved. She understood what that meant. She had once lived inside exactly that kind of weight, the particular pressure of events, where how you perform publicly shapes what happens to your career privately. She had no career left to shape that way. She had already been through every version of those stakes. What she had now was simpler. She had one afternoon in one airspace over one airfield, flying an aircraft she knew with the precision of an extended conversation. And somewhere in the week before this event, when she had reviewed the full list of demonstration pilots who would be sharing that airspace, she had read Noah Bennett's name and noted his age and his flight hours, and something in the combination of those numbers had given her a quiet, unspecific concern that she had not been able to fully name or set aside. It wasn't instinct exactly. It was experience. The difference between the two is that instinct arrives uninvited. Experience is the thing you carry so long, it starts to look like instinct. She closed her notebook, tucked it back into her bag, and stood up. It was almost time to brief her own sequence. She had 4 hours until her flight window. She was going to use every minute. And somewhere on the flight line, Master Sergeant Hayes was walking back to her aircraft for the 3rd time that morning, not because his checklist required it, but because something in the way she had moved around that airframe, something in the precision of her concern and the specificity of her knowledge had given him the same unspecific feeling that experience always leaves behind. The feeling that says, pay attention. The feeling that says this matters more than it looks. The feeling that says you are not dealing with what you think you are dealing with. He put his hands on the wing root and applied careful pressure and listened. And what he heard confirmed what he already suspected. This aircraft was as ready as an aircraft could be. The woman who was going to fly it was more ready still. And the afternoon that was coming was going to change something. Not loudly, not with announcement, but in the quiet and irreversible way that certain truths always change things. The clock on the hangar wall moved forward. The Nevada sky waited above it all, flat and bright, and completely indifferent to who was ready and who was not. The laughter from the briefing room had barely faded when Claire Morgan walked out onto the flight line and did something that nobody expected. She smiled. Not at anyone. Not for anyone. Just a small, private smile that lasted less than 2 seconds before it disappeared back into the composed stillness that seemed to be her natural resting state. She picked up her flight bag, adjusted the strap across her shoulder, and walked toward her aircraft with the unhurried certainty of someone who had already decided exactly how this day was going to go, even if nobody else had caught up to that decision yet. Master Sergeant Daniel Hayes was waiting for her at the aircraft. He had his clipboard in one hand and a thermos of coffee in the other, and he had the look of a man who had spent the last 40 minutes thinking hard about something and had not yet reached a satisfying conclusion. He fell into step beside her without preamble. I need to ask you something, he said. Ask, she said. The forward spar point, the manufacturing run advisory. He paused. That document had a distribution list of 11 people in the entire country. I was one of them. My senior structural engineer was one of them. He stopped walking. How were you on that list? Claire set her flight bag down beside the aircraft and turned to face him. She looked at him with the direct, unhurried attention of someone who was deciding exactly how much of an answer a question deserved. I wasn't on that list, she said. Hayes stared at her. Then how? I've flown 14 aircraft with that manufacturing run number, she said simply. Over 11 years. I know what the stress pattern feels like at 200 hours past the recommended inspection interval. I know what it sounds like at altitude, and I know what it looks like in the wing-root flex ratio under a 3G turn. She picked her bag back up. You don't need a distribution list for that. You need time in the aircraft. Hayes stood very still for a moment. Then he said, very quietly, 14 aircraft. 14, she confirmed. He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his face shifted, not dramatically, not with any particular visible emotion, but with the subtle realignment of a man who has just recalibrated an assumption he didn't realize he was making. Ms. Morgan, he said carefully, I've been chief mechanic on military aviation events for 19 years. I have seen every category of pilot that exists in this country walk through this flight line. He paused again. What is your total flight hour count? She looked at him. That's a complicated number, she said. Give me the round figure. A beat. Over 9,000, she said. Hayes said nothing for 3 full seconds. Then he nodded once, a single, slow, deliberate nod, and stepped aside to give her full access to the aircraft without another word. He didn't ask anything else. He didn't need to. 9,000 hours doesn't require explanation. 9,000 hours is its own complete sentence. She went back to work on the pre-flight sequence, and Hayes stood back and watched, and every small thing she did confirmed the number she had given him in a way that no document or credential could have matched. 40 meters away near the fuel staging area, Noah Bennett had his tablet out and was reviewing his afternoon flight sequence for the 3rd time. He was not reviewing it because he didn't know it. He was reviewing it because something had been sitting uncomfortably at the edge of his thinking since the conversation with Ethan an hour earlier, and working through familiar material was the mental habit he defaulted to when something was bothering him and he couldn't name it precisely. The civilian demonstration was in the 2nd position of the afternoon sequence. He had checked that twice because he remembered it being listed 3rd in the original manifest, and the change had appeared without announcement in the updated scheduling notification from the operations center. He didn't know who had moved it or why, but it meant Claire Morgan would be in the air before most of the military demonstration sequence began, and somehow that felt significant in a way he couldn't fully articulate. He pulled up her public performance record on his tablet, the kind of basic background information that was accessible through the event's official documentation portal. 8 years of civilian aviation shows, restored aircraft demonstrations, safety record perfect, certifications current and comprehensive. Prior aviation background listed simply as extensive commercial and private. It was the vagueness of that last entry that had been bothering him, extensive commercial and private. That was the kind of language people used when they were summarizing something they couldn't fully describe in the space available, or when they were summarizing something they had been specifically asked to keep brief. He put his tablet down and looked across the flight line at Claire, who was currently crouching beside the port landing gear assembly in a position that looked uncomfortable and staying there for what seemed like an unnecessarily long time. "What are you looking for?" he murmured to himself, though he didn't intend anyone to hear it. "Something most people walk right past." He startled. Ethan Walker had appeared at his shoulder with 2 cups of coffee from the line operations station, holding one out to Noah without looking at him, his eyes fixed in the same direction Noah had been looking. "What do you mean?" Noah asked, taking the cup. "The gear assembly on that airframe type has a specific drag link wear pattern that doesn't show up on visual inspection from a standing position," Ethan said. He paused. "You have to crouch at exactly that angle to see it." Noah looked at him. "How do you know that?" Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Because I spent 3 months learning that airframe type 2 years ago, as part of a cross-training program." He took a slow drink of his coffee. "There were 7 pilots in that program. We were all considered high-aptitude candidates for a Heritage Aviation Preservation Initiative." "I didn't know you did that," Noah said. "Most people don't." He paused. "I wasn't the best in that program. There was one pilot who was completely in a different category from everyone else." He stopped. "The instructors called her. He stopped again. He turned his coffee cup in his hand slowly. "Doesn't matter." "What did they call her?" Noah pressed. Ethan shook his head slightly. "Old military nickname. Probably doesn't mean anything." But he was still watching Claire. And his expression was no longer the easy, certain confidence of the man who had laughed in the briefing room 2 hours ago. It was something quieter and harder to name, the expression of a person who is standing at the edge of a thought they don't quite want to complete. In the operations center, Sergeant Major Collins had finished reading the third folder. He had set it down on his desk with the particular care people use when they are handling something that deserves to be handled carefully, and he had sat in his chair for 11 minutes without speaking to anyone or responding to any of the radio traffic that moved through the room around him. Lieutenant Colonel Santos had checked on him, once seen his expression, and quietly redirected 2 junior officers who had been about to approach his desk with routine questions. Finally, Collins stood up. He walked to the operations center window and looked out at the flight line and found Claire's aircraft in the lineup without any difficulty. From this distance, she was a small figure in a dark jacket moving around the airframe with the focused economy he now recognized from the after-action report he had just finished reading. The report was from 15 years ago. It described a night mission in a mountainous theater of operations, the kind of theater where weather and geography combined to create conditions that made experienced pilots genuinely afraid. The mission had been a personnel extraction, an urgent one, the kind where urgent meant that people would die if the timeline slipped by more than minutes. The primary extraction aircraft had taken ground fire on the approach and been forced to abort. The secondary had developed a mechanical failure that his crew correctly identified as mission ending. Every protocol in existence at that point called for the mission to be suspended and the ground team to hold position for a secondary attempt at first light. The problem was that the ground team's position had been compromised. First light was not a survivable option for the 23 soldiers holding that position in the dark. What happened next was described in the report in the flat, careful language of official military documentation, which meant that between every line of dry procedural text, there was an enormous amount of human reality that the language was struggling to contain. A pilot flying a support aircraft, listed in the report only by call sign because the mission had certain classification requirements that had since been restructured but not fully lifted, had made an unauthorized approach to the extraction zone. Flying a different aircraft type than the mission called for. Flying through conditions that the weather officer had already marked as outside acceptable operational parameters. Flying alone without a second crew member because there hadn't been time to brief anyone else on what she was doing before she did it. She had gotten all 23 soldiers out. She had taken 2 hits on the way out that should have ended the flight and managed the aircraft damage on instruments alone because the visual systems were compromised. She had landed that aircraft with systems in a state that Hayes' entire ground crew reading the post-mission technical report would have classified as unsurvivable. She had walked away from the aircraft, filed her debrief, and been very specifically asked by her commanding officer at the time to allow the mission to be documented in a way that protected certain operational details for an indefinite period. She had agreed. And then she had continued to serve for 3 more years before transitioning out of military aviation with a record that the general public would never fully see. Collins pressed his hand flat against the glass of the operations center window. 23 soldiers. He had not been one of them, but he had commanded the adjacent unit during that period, and he had known some of the men who were. He had listened to their accounts in the weeks that followed. He had read fragments of the official record. He had heard the call sign ghostwriter spoken in the particular tone that people use when they are trying to give a name the weight it actually deserves. He had never known who it was until today. He picked up his radio. Collins to ground operations. I need a quiet word with Chief Hayes when he has 90 seconds. The radio crackled. Copy, Sergeant Major. Collins put the radio down and looked at the clock. 2 hours and 40 minutes until the afternoon demonstration sequence began. He was going to use that time carefully. Back on the flight line, Claire had finished the gear assembly check and was standing upright, making a notation in her small book. Hayes appeared at her left shoulder without ceremony. Collins wants a word, Hayes said. She didn't look up from the notebook. I know. Hayes paused. You know, I recognized his name on the operations manifest this morning, she said. She closed the notebook. He was in the adjacent command during a deployment I was part of. He's a careful man. He would have done some checking. She put the notebook in her bag. Tell him I'll come by the operations center after my noon fuel check. Hayes studied her face. Is there something I should know about today? She looked at him directly. Today is a demonstration flight. The aircraft is ready. The sequence is clear. The weather is acceptable. She met his eyes. That is everything there is to know about today until the moment something changes. And if something changes, you'll hear from me before anyone else does. Hayes held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded. I'll tell him noon. He walked away. Claire looked up at the sky. Not with worry, not with uncertainty, with the quiet measuring attention of someone reading information that is available to those who know what to look for. The wind was shifting slightly from its morning direction. Not dangerously, but enough to note. She made a small mark in her notebook and moved to the next item on her own mental checklist. At 11:47, Ethan Walker did something that surprised even himself. He walked across the flight line toward Claire's aircraft, alone without Noah, without the easy audience of other pilots, without the social safety net of a group that would laugh if he laughed and move on if he moved on. He walked alone, which meant whatever happened next was only between him and her. She was rechecking the control surface response on the port aileron when he arrived. She didn't stop what she was doing when she heard him approach, which he found unexpectedly disarming. Most people paused what they were doing when Ethan Walker approached. It was one of those small social habits he had grown so accustomed to that he had stopped noticing it until it wasn't there. Can I ask you something, he said. She continued with the aileron check. You can ask. The forward spar point advisory, he said. Hayes told me you went right to it. She finished the check, made a mark, and turned to face him. She waited. That advisory was restricted distribution, he said. 11 people. I know because I was number 8 on that list. He paused. I know every name above and below mine. Yours wasn't on it. She looked at him with that same level, unhurried steadiness. Then how do you explain it? He asked. I already explained it to Hayes. Explain it to me. A pause, something in her expression shifted, not softening exactly, but adjusting the way a person adjusts when they decide to give a real answer instead of a sufficient one. When I was 24 years old, she said, I flew an aircraft with that spar configuration for the first time. I felt something in the wing flex under a sustained turn that didn't match the spec sheet. I wrote it up. Nobody acted on it. I flew it again 6 weeks later, and the same aircraft experienced a partial spar failure at altitude. She held his gaze. The pilot walked away, not because of anything in the spec sheet, because the failure happened at a moment in the flight profile where it was survivable. She paused. I have been checking that point on every compatible airframe I have touched since that day. I do not need a distribution list to tell me where to look. I need the memory of what it costs when you don't. Ethan was silent for a moment that stretched long enough to feel significant. How old is that memory? He asked. 15 years, she said. He looked at the aircraft, then back at her. How many aircraft have you flown? She looked at him for a moment longer than the question required. Enough, she said. It was the same answer she had given him that morning, but it landed completely differently now. He cleared his throat, started to say something, stopped. The call sign, he said finally. His voice was quieter than it had been all the way. Not the performance voice, not the briefing room voice. Just a man's voice asking something he genuinely didn't know the answer to. Ghostwriter, where does it come from? Claire looked at him. She reached into her flight bag and pulled out something small. A worn, laminated card, the kind of identification card that gets carried in a breast pocket for years until the laminate starts to crack at the corners. She held it out to him. He took it. It was a military flight authorization card, the kind that stops being active when a service record closes. The information on it was spare and official, a photograph, a name, a unit designation, and in the field marked call sign, 2 words in capital letters, Ghostwriter. Ethan looked at the photograph. It was taken 15 years ago at minimum, maybe more. But the face in the photograph was recognizable. Not because of dramatic difference or sameness, it was recognizable because the steadiness in the eyes was identical to what he had been looking at all morning. He stood holding that card for a moment that felt longer than it was. Then he held it back out to her. She took it, slid it back into the flight bag, and turned back to the aircraft. Ethan stood there for a moment longer. I owe you an apology, he said. His voice was flat and direct, the way men's voices get when they're saying something real, and they don't want the emotion in it to provide an excuse to take it back. What I said this morning, in the briefing room. She was looking at the aircraft. Yes, she said, you do. He nodded. I'm sorry. She turned and looked at him one more time. Her expression was not warm or cold. It was honest. I know you are, she said. Whether you understand why will depend on what you pay attention to this afternoon. She turned back to the aircraft. He walked away. And for the first time all day, Ethan Walker did not know exactly what he was walking toward. In the operations center, Collins was on the radio with a former colleague, a man named General Warren Ashby, currently stationed in Virginia, who had been part of the operational command structure during the theater deployment referenced in the after-action report Collins had spent the morning reading. I need to ask you about Ghostwriter, Collins said. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Where is this coming from? Ashby asked. His voice had changed. It was careful now in the way voices go careful when they're moving into territory they've been careful about for a long time. She's here, Collins said. On my flight line, today. Another pause, longer this time. Bob, Ashby said, and his voice had dropped in the way that voices drop when they stop being official and start being something more human. She asked for that record to stay quiet. You know that. I know, Collins said. I'm not going to say anything she hasn't already decided to say. I just need to understand what I'm looking at. Ashby was quiet for a moment. What you're looking at is the reason 23 men went home to their families, he said simply. That's what you're looking at. Collins pressed his hand flat on the desk in front of him. There are 32 young pilots on this flight line, Collins said. A good number of them spent this morning laughing at her. Ashby made a sound that was not quite a laugh. It was the sound of a man who recognized a specific kind of irony from a specific kind of distance. They won't be laughing by the end of the day, he said. She never needed anyone to set the record straight. The record always sets itself. Why did she come back? Collins asked. After everything. Why is she still flying? Ashby was quiet for several seconds. You'd have to ask her, he said finally. But if I had to guess, he paused. Some people fly because they want to be seen. And some people fly because it's the only place they've ever felt like themselves. A beat. She is very much the second kind. Collins thanked him, ended the call. He looked at the clock. 1 hour and 50 minutes. He looked out the window at the flight line, at the small figure in the dark jacket still moving around the aircraft with the same quiet precision she had maintained all day. Noah Bennett had been watching from the edge of the hangar for 20 minutes when Ethan came back from the flight line. He could tell from the way Ethan was walking that something had changed. Not dramatically, Ethan didn't do dramatic, but the walk was different. The easy roll of complete confidence was still there in the mechanics because it had been in his body long enough to be automatic. But the expression on his face was doing something it hadn't been doing all morning. It was uncertain. Not panicked, not distressed, just uncertain in the quiet way of a man who has encountered something he didn't have room for in his existing picture of how things worked. What happened? Noah asked. Ethan sat down on the equipment case outside the hangar and looked at the tarmac for a moment. I asked her about the call sign. Noah waited. She's military, Ethan said. Was military. 11 years of flight deployments. Her service record is behind classification that's only been partially lifted. He paused. She has 9,000 flight hours, Noah. Noah stared at him. 9,000, Ethan repeated. Noah sat down on the adjacent equipment case. They sat side by side for a moment in silence. I have 840, Noah said quietly. I have 2,900, Ethan said, including everything. Every simulator hour, every cross-training program, everything. He paused. She has 9,000 in real aircraft. A long silence. What did you say to her? Noah asked. I apologized. Noah looked at him. Of all the things Ethan could have said, that was possibly the one he had least expected. She accepted it, Noah asked. She accepted it, Ethan said. And then she said something. He paused. She said whether I understood why would depend on what I paid attention to this afternoon. Noah turned that over for a moment. What does that mean? He asked. I think it means she's going to show us something, Ethan said, and she wants to know if we're capable of seeing it. Noah looked out at the flight line. He said. I looked up her public record this morning. 8 years on the civilian circuit. I know. Before that, nothing. No public record. Clean cutoff. I know. That's not normal, Noah said. Even transitioning military pilots have public trails. I know, Ethan said again. Noah turned to look at him. Do you think she's actually... He stopped. He wasn't sure how to complete the sentence. I think, Ethan said slowly, that we spent this morning in a room with someone who has done things we genuinely cannot imagine, and we laughed at her name. He picked up his coffee cup, found it empty, set it back down. I think we need to pay very close attention this afternoon, because I have the feeling that whatever she's about to do in that airspace, it's going to be the most important thing we see today. He stood up. Come on, he said, let's get positioned where we have a clear view. Noah stood. They walked together toward the viewing corridor, and for the first time all day, neither of them was talking over the other or performing for anyone. They were just two pilots walking towards something they didn't yet fully understand and being honest with themselves for possibly the first time today about exactly how much they didn't know. At 12:15, Claire walked into the operations center. Collins was standing at his desk when she entered. He looked at her and she looked at him, and between them passed the particular recognition of two people who share a context that has no easy language around it. Sergeant Major Collins, she said. Ms. Morgan, he said. He paused. Claire. She tilted her head slightly at the use of her first name. It was not an objection. It was an acknowledgement. He gestured toward the chair across from his desk. She sat. He remained standing for a moment, and then he sat too, and he folded his hands on the desk in front of him, and he looked at her with the direct, honest attention of a man who has spent the morning reading about someone and is now trying to reconcile the document with the person. I read the after-action report, he said. She met his gaze, said nothing. All of it, he said, the parts that were still marked. I have the clearance. I know you do, she said. That's why I didn't try to block the request when Hayes told me you made it. Collins looked at her for a moment. You knew I made it. Hayes told me after the fuel check, she said simply. I assumed you would. You're a thorough man. It's the right instinct. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. 23 soldiers, he said. She said nothing. You never told anyone, he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement, and underneath it was something that might have been awe or grief or both at once. I told the people who needed to know, she said. At the time, in the appropriate channels. She looked at him steadily. The mission was documented. The record exists. What I didn't do was attach my name to it in spaces where it would be used to build a story I didn't need. Why not? He asked. You earned that story. She looked at him for a long moment. Because the story isn't about me, she said. It never was. It was about 23 people getting home. She paused. The moment I make it about me, I change what it was. Collins was quiet for a long moment. Outside the operations center window, The afternoon sequence was beginning to take shape on the flight line. Aircraft were being moved into their demonstration positions. Ground crews were running final checks. The crowd that had assembled along the perimeter was growing. "There are 32 young pilots out there," Collins said. "I know," she said. "Some of them." "I know," she said again, and her voice was not harsh, but it was complete. "They did what young people do when they're confident and haven't yet learned what they don't know." She paused. "I was young once. I made the same mistake in different directions." "What do you want from today?" he asked. She looked at him with the particular directness of someone who has been asked a question they have already given a full answer to inside their own head. "To fly well," she said. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he stood up, and she stood up with him, and he extended his hand across the desk. She took it. The handshake lasted exactly as long as it needed to, and when it ended, both of them understood that something had been acknowledged between them that would not need to be spoken about again. "Fly well," he said. "I intend to," she said. She walked out. Collins stood at his window and watched her cross the flight line back toward her aircraft. She walked at the same pace she always walked, the same posture, the same economy of movement. Nothing about her had changed. Everything about how he saw her had changed. And in 1 hour and 20 minutes, he thought the 32 young pilots on that flight line were going to discover the same thing. Not because anyone was going to tell them. Not because a file was going to be opened or a record revealed or an announcement made, but because she was going to climb into that cockpit and fly. And some things Collins had learned over 37 years don't require any introduction. They speak entirely for themselves. Part 3, 1 hour and 15 minutes before the afternoon demonstration sequence. Ethan Walker did something he had not done in a very long time. He sat down alone and stayed quiet. Not the performative quiet of a man collecting himself before a big moment. The actual quiet of a man who has run out of confident things to say and is sitting with that emptiness without trying to fill it. He found a spot on the metal bench outside the secondary equipment bay, away from the other pilots, away from the cameras and the crowd building along the perimeter, and he sat with his elbows on his knees and his hands folded, and he stared at the tarmac between his boots. He kept seeing that laminated card, the photograph on it, the eyes in the photograph, the call sign printed in capital letters in the official field that nobody stamps with casual words. Ghost Rider. He had laughed at that name in front of 30 people. He had held a microphone and pointed at her and laughed. And she had stood there with those eyes and said nothing because she didn't need to say anything because she already knew something. He was only beginning to understand that the truth doesn't need to defend itself. It just needs time. He rubbed his face with both hands and straightened up. Noah appeared from around the corner of the equipment bay, holding 2 bottles of water, and stopped when he saw Ethan's expression. He handed 1 bottle over without comment and sat on the far end of the bench. They sat in silence for a moment. "I keep thinking about something," Noah said finally. "What?" "When she walked into that briefing room this morning." Noah turned the water bottle in his hands. She didn't react. Not to any of it. Not to the laugh, not to the comment about her aircraft, not to any of it. He paused. "At the time, I thought it was because she didn't care." Ethan waited. "But that's not it," Noah said. "Is it?" "No," Ethan said quietly. "That's not it." "She's done harder things than this," Noah said. A room full of pilots laughing at her call sign. He shook his head slowly. "That didn't even register on whatever scale she's actually measuring things by." Ethan said nothing. "What does that feel like?" Noah asked, not to Ethan specifically, just to the air between them. To have done something that big and just carry it quietly for 15 years. Neither of them had an answer to that, but the question sat between them and changed the texture of the silence around it. At 12:49, the operations center radio crackled with the first sequence update of the afternoon. Ground crews moved to their final positions. The crowd along the perimeter fence had swelled to several hundred. The cameras were live. 2 network feeds and 1 defense industry broadcast had their lenses pointed at the flight line, and the official event announcer was running through preliminary remarks in the public address system. Collins stood at his window and watched all of it with the particular stillness of a man who is waiting for the only part of the afternoon that actually matters to him. Lieutenant Colonel Santos appeared at his shoulder. "Sequence is confirmed," she said. "Civilian demonstration is second. Military sequence begins at 1400. "Good," Collins said. Santos hesitated. Sir, I pulled the partial record on Morgan this morning after you made the documentation request. She paused. The service years. Collins turned to look at her. I didn't read all of it, she said carefully. I didn't have clearance for the full file, but the years of service, the deployment theater list. She stopped. Is she who I think she is? Collins looked at her for a moment. Depends on who you think she is, he said. Santos held his gaze. Ghost Rider, she said quietly. The real one. The extraction mission, 15 years ago. Collins turned back to the window. Stand here with me, he said. Watch the second demonstration. Santos stood beside him and said nothing more, because nothing more was needed. At 1300 exactly, Claire Morgan climbed into her cockpit. She did it the way she did everything, without ceremony, without performance, with the complete and unhurried attention of someone for whom this specific act was as natural as standing up from a chair. She settled into the seat, ran her hands across the instrument panel in a specific sequence that Hayes, watching from the ground, recognized as not a standard startup, check, but something more personal, a conversation between a pilot and an aircraft that had its own private language. Hayes stood at his position near the ground crew station with his radio in his hand and his eyes on the aircraft, and he felt something he had not expected to feel when this morning started. He felt the particular wordless respect that one craftsman feels for another when the quality of the work makes itself visible beyond any possibility of argument. Reyes appeared beside him. Chief, she's running the startup sequence out of order. Hayes shook his head. No, she isn't. Reyes frowned at his checklist. The fuel priming step is supposed to come after them. Give me that, Hayes said. He took the checklist, looked at it, then looked at the aircraft, then looked at Reyes. That checklist was written for standard atmospheric conditions at sea level. He handed it back. We're at 4,200 feet elevation, and the ambient temperature is 11 degrees above the standard operating baseline. She's compensating for vapor pressure differential in the fuel line. He paused. The sequence she's running is more correct than the one on that paper. Reyes stared at the aircraft for a moment. How does she know that? He asked. 9,000 hours, Hayes said simply. The engine caught. It was not a spectacular sound. It was the honest mechanical sound of an aircraft engine doing what aircraft engines do when they have been properly prepared and correctly started. But there was something in the steadiness of it, the immediate, clean, confident idle, that followed the startup sequence that made Hayes close his eyes for exactly 1 second, in the way that people close their eyes when they hear something that sounds exactly right. She's ready, he said into his radio. Ground crew clear to perimeter positions. In the public address booth, the event announcer cleared his throat and looked at the sequence card in front of him. Ladies and gentlemen, our first demonstration of the afternoon sequence features a restored classic aircraft in the capable hands of civilian aviation performer and callsign Ghost Rider Claire Morgan. Along the perimeter fence, the crowd applauded with the polite, moderate enthusiasm of people who are being courteous about a warm-up act before the main event. In the viewing corridor, where the military demonstration pilots had gathered, Ethan and Noah stood side by side in the group of 32. Several pilots around them were talking, checking their own pre-flight notes, tracking the crowd response, with the particular awareness of people who know they will be in that airspace soon. Ethan was not talking. He was watching the aircraft begin its taxi toward the runway, and he was not doing anything else. And his face was doing something that Noah noticed but did not comment on it, was doing the work of a man who is preparing to see something he doesn't yet have the framework to fully understand. The aircraft reached the runway threshold, paused. The engine note changed. And then Claire Morgan did something with that aircraft that nobody who was watching was fully prepared for. She didn't build the takeoff roll gradually the way demonstration pilots typically do, giving the crowd time to follow the increasing speed, building visual anticipation, working the moment for maximum effect. She opened the throttle with a decisiveness that was almost jarring, and the aircraft accelerated down the runway with an urgency that made the crowd along the perimeter fence go very quiet very quickly. The rotation was precise. Not showy, precise. There is an important difference, and it is the difference between a pilot performing for an audience and a pilot flying the aircraft to the exact limit of its correct capability. She left the ground and immediately banked, left a bank angle that every pilot in the viewing corridor registered in their body before their mind caught up with it, because That angle was at the edge of what that airframe type was rated for, and she held it controlled. It owned it completely with an authority that was visible from the ground in the way that genuine mastery is always visible. Not because it announces itself, but because it looks effortless, even when everyone watching knows it isn't. What is she? Someone behind Ethan started. Quiet, Ethan said. The person went quiet. She leveled out of the bank and went vertical. A full committed vertical climb in an aircraft that the younger pilots had spent the morning thinking of as a museum piece. The aircraft went straight up with its nose pointed at the Nevada sky, and for 3 seconds, 3 full counted seconds, it held that climb at a rate that made Hayes, standing at his ground crew station, involuntarily put his hand to his mouth. "She's pulling 4 Gs in that airframe," said a pilot behind Noah. "That aircraft's structural ceiling in a sustained climb is—" "She knows what the structural ceiling is," Ethan said. He said it quietly. He said it with complete certainty. And the pilot behind him said nothing else. "She reached the top of the climb, inverted." The aircraft rolled at the top of the vertical clean and controlled and geometrically perfect, and came down into a split S maneuver that placed her at exactly the right altitude and heading to begin the horizontal portion of her sequence. And every pilot watching from the corridor had done the mental math before she completed it and had arrived at the same conclusion. The precision was not normal, not performer normal, not civilian circuit normal. It was military precision. It was the kind of precision that comes from years of flying in conditions where imprecision has consequences that last longer than the moment. "She's flying this like a combat sequence," Noah said quietly. He didn't mean it as a dramatic observation. He meant it as a simple, honest technical assessment. "That's not a demonstration profile. That's a tactical sequence." Ethan said nothing. He was watching. The horizontal run brought her across the field at low altitude, and at 300 meters from the viewing corridor, she did something with the aircraft's attitude that made 3 different military pilots in the group physically step forward, an involuntary, instinctive movement of people who are watching something their body recognizes as important before their conscious mind has finished processing why. She had put the aircraft into a controlled energy bleed maneuver, bleeding speed while maintaining altitude and attitude in a way that is almost never done outside of specific tactical situations. It is the kind of thing you do when you need to position quickly over a precise point with minimal forward momentum. It is the kind of thing you do when you are putting an aircraft down on a surface where 1 extra meter of overrun ends the mission and potentially ends the crew. It is not a demonstration maneuver. It is a survival maneuver. She executed it with the same quiet authority she had used on everything else. "Oh my God," said Captain Daria Morris from 2 positions down the viewing line. She said it very quietly, but in the particular silence that had fallen over the pilot group, quiet was enough. "She's showing us." "What?" said the pilot beside her. "She's showing us," Morse said again, "what it actually looks like. The real thing." She shook her head slowly. "I've seen this in training footage, historical footage. I've never seen it live." Ethan turned to look at Morse for half a second. Morse was not a person who said things for effect. She was precise, skeptical, and professionally conservative in her judgments. If she was saying it, she had run the analysis and arrived at a conclusion. Ethan turned back to the aircraft. In the operations center, Collins and Santos stood at the window and watched in silence. Santos had her hand on the window ledge. Collins had not moved in 4 minutes. The radio on Collins's desk crackled twice and went quiet again. Neither of them reached for it. Below them, on the tarmac, the ground crew had gone still. All of them, not the organized stillness of personnel at their assigned positions. The spontaneous stillness of people who have stopped doing everything else because what they are watching requires their full attention. Hayes stood with his radio at his side and his eyes on the aircraft. His expression was not the expression of a man watching a performance. It was the expression of a man watching the confirmation of something he had suspected all morning, the relief and gravity of a hypothesis proven true, with all the weight that carries when the hypothesis concerns something of genuine importance. Rhea stood beside him and said in a very small voice, "Chief, who is she?" Hayes didn't look away from the aircraft. "She's the reason we still check that forward spar point," he said. "That's who she is." Reyes looked at the aircraft and then back at Hayes and then back at the aircraft, and he didn't ask anything else. Claire was running the third segment of her sequence now, the portion that the event program listed simply as Precision Maneuver Series. What the program description could not have communicated because there was no language in an event program. Adequate to it was that the Precision Maneuver Series she was flying bore no resemblance to any civilian demonstration sequence any pilot on that field had ever seen. She was flying it like someone mapping an extraction route at altitude. She was flying it like someone who had at some point in her life needed to know exactly how much space an aircraft needs to turn around inside a mountain valley at night. She was flying it like someone who had made decisions in the air where the margin between a correct choice and an incorrect one was measured in feet and seconds and the lives of people on the ground below. The sequence ran for 11 minutes. 11 minutes during which the crowd along the perimeter went from polite applause to genuine silence to a particular kind of collective held breath that requires something extraordinary to produce. 11 minutes during which 32 of the best young military pilots in America stood in their viewing corridor and were educated not by a lecture, not by a document, not by anyone telling them what to think, but by the simple, inarguable evidence of what mastery actually looks like when it is applied without apology and without performance. At minute 7, something shifted in the group. It was not announced. It was not orchestrated. It simply happened the way genuine shifts happen organically from the inside because the reality of what they were watching had finally overcome whatever they had walked in believing. 3 pilots began taking notes on their tablets. Not official notes, personal notes, the kind of notes you take when you're accurately. 2 others had stopped talking completely, not in the distracted way of people whose conversation has wandered, but in the focused way of people who have decided that what they are watching deserves their full silence. And in the back of the group, a pilot named Lieutenant James Calloway, 28 years old, 210 flight hours. One of the pilots who had smiled in the briefing room that morning quietly said something to the pilot beside him that nobody else was close enough to hear. But whatever he said made the pilot beside him nod slowly and look back at the aircraft with different eyes. At minute 9, she began the final segment. And the final segment was the one that nobody was prepared for. She brought the aircraft down to an altitude that made Hayes grip his radio with both hands and made Collins put his hand flat on the glass of the operations center window. It was not a dangerous altitude. She was not in violation of any safety parameter. But it was an altitude that communicated something with absolute clarity, that this pilot was comfortable operating in spaces where the margin is real and the correction time is short. It was an altitude where if something goes wrong, you have exactly one decision available, and you have about 2 seconds to make it, and it has to be right. She flew the final segment at that altitude. Straight level controlled with the complete and unhurried authority of a woman who has been making correct decisions in 2-second windows for 11 years and has never once used up all the time available. And then she landed. The landing was not spectacular. It was not intended to be. It was a correct landing. The gear touched at the right point, at the right speed, with the right attitude, and the aircraft rolled out cleanly to the turnoff point and was done. The crowd along the perimeter fence erupted. Not the polite applause of before, a genuine full-voiced crowd response that filled the Nevada air above the airfield with the particular sound of people who have just witnessed something they know they will remember. In the viewing corridor, nobody moved for a moment. Then someone started clapping. It was not Ethan. It was not Noah. It was Captain Daria Morse who began clapping with the deliberate, honest appreciation of a professional who does not give that response unless it is completely warranted. And once she started, the group around her followed in the unforced way that genuine responses always spread. Ethan clapped. He didn't make a production of it. He didn't say anything. He simply brought his hands together in a steady, sustained rhythm that was the most honest thing he had done all day, and he kept his eyes on the aircraft rolling toward the parking position. Noah was clapping beside him, and Noah's face was doing something Ethan hadn't seen on it before, the specific expression of a person who has had the experience of their own assumptions demonstrated to be wrong in a way that doesn't feel bad. It feels clarifying, like pressure releasing from a space that had been too tightly sealed. Ethan, Noah said, "Yeah, I'm really glad I was standing here for that." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Me too," he said. In the operations center, Collins turned from the window and looked at Santos. Santos looked back at him. Between them passed the wordless communication of two people who have just watched something confirm everything they already knew. It would confirm, and the confirmation is not a surprise, but is still somehow moving. She's good, Santos said. She meant it as a complete sentence, not a preamble to anything. She's the best pilot on this flight line today, Collins said. He didn't say it with drama. He said it as a factual assessment delivered by a man who had seen enough to know what the word best actually means when it is applied to something real. Including me, including every uniform out there. Santos nodded once. Collins picked up his radio. Ground Operations Sergeant Major Collins. I want a full debrief room set up for 14:30. All pilots, civilian included. A pause on the radio. Copy, sir. All pilots. All pilots, he confirmed. And I want the civilian demonstration listed first on the debrief agenda. Another pause. Understood, sir. He set the radio down. Santos looked at him. She won't want to be made a spectacle. I'm not making her a spectacle, Collins said. I'm making sure the 32 people in that room understand what they watched. He paused. There's a difference. At the aircraft parking position, Claire was going through the post-flight shutdown sequence with the same attention she had given every other phase of the day. The engine cooling, the instrument confirmation, the logbook entry, everything in its correct order at its correct pace. Hayes approached while she was still in the cockpit. She looked down at him. How did she feel, he asked. Claire considered the question for a moment with the seriousness it deserved. She felt like herself, she said, like she always does when she's been properly prepared. Hayes nodded. He reached up and put his hand on the wing root, not a gesture of ownership or inspection. Just a hand on the aircraft, the way you put a hand on something you respect. Ms. Morgan, he said, I have been doing this job for 19 years. I have worked with some of the finest pilots in this country. He paused, and his voice had the slightly roughened quality of a man who is saying something true and is aware of the weight of it. That was the finest 20 minutes of flying I have seen in person in 19 years. Claire looked at him for a moment. Thank you, Daniel, she said. It was the first time she had used his first name. He noticed. He didn't comment on it. He simply nodded again and stepped back to give her room to climb out. She was barely on the ground before Reyes was there. He had sprinted from his position at the perimeter of the ground crew area, and he was 22 years old and had not yet learned to moderate the directness of his reactions, and he arrived in front of her, slightly out of breath, with his eyes carrying the particular light of a young person whose world has just been meaningfully expanded. Ma'am, he said, the energy bleed maneuver at the end of the second segment. He stopped, collected himself. How long did it take you to develop the inputs for that at that airframe weight? Claire looked at him. Something in her expression shifted, not a smile exactly, but the warming of something that had been held carefully neutral all day. Sit down with me at the debrief, she said. Bring your questions. Bring all of them. Reyes stared at her for a moment. Yes, ma'am, he said. He said it with the instinctive formality of someone who has just determined that the situation requires it, even though she was not his commanding officer and there was no military obligation in the word. He stepped back. Claire picked up her flight bag, and then Noah Bennett appeared. He had covered the distance from the viewing quarter at something close to a jog, and he arrived without his easy performance face, without the social confidence that had been his default register all morning. He arrived as himself, 26 years old, 840 hours, a good pilot who was still in the early chapters of understanding what good really means. He stood in front of her and for a moment didn't say anything. She waited. I'm Noah Bennett, he said. Lieutenant, I was in the briefing room this morning. I know who you are, she said. He took a breath. I smiled, he said. When Ethan laughed at your call sign, I didn't say anything, but I smiled. He held her gaze. I want you to know I understand what that means, and I'm sorry. Claire looked at him for a long moment, the full unhurried attention she gave to everything. How many hours do you have? She asked. He blinked slightly at the question. 840, he said. At 840 hours, she said. I flew a night extraction mission through a mountain valley in wind conditions that my weather officer told me were not survivable. She paused. I didn't do it because I knew everything. I did it because I knew enough, and I knew which parts I didn't know, and I stayed within what the aircraft could give me. She held his gaze. The most important thing you will learn in the next 800 hours is not technique. It is the difference between confidence and certainty. Confidence is something you earn. Certainty is something you have to be very careful about. Noah stood very still. That's what this morning was, he said quietly. Wasn't it? Certainty. Yes, she said simply. He nodded slowly. Will you come to the debrief? He asked. Collins already asked me, she said. I'll be there. Noah stepped back to make way for her, and as he did, Ethan appeared at his shoulder. He had been standing far enough back to give Noah his moment, which was itself a small thing that would have surprised the man who had grabbed the microphone in the briefing room that morning. Claire looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at her. What you did up there, he said. He stopped. Started again. I've logged 2,900 hours. I know what I'm looking at. He paused. What you did up there was not a demonstration. That was. He stopped again, and for the first time all day, the man who always had the right word available didn't have one. Real, she said simply. He held her gaze. Yeah, he said. Real. He stepped aside. She walked toward the operations building. And behind her, in the space she had moved through, something had changed that was not going to change back. Something in how 32 pilots understood what the word real meant when it was applied to the thing they all did with their lives. But none of them knew yet that the afternoon was not finished. None of them knew that in 47 minutes, the skills they had just watched, demonstrated in an 11-minute sequence above a Nevada airfield, were not going to remain theoretical. In 47 minutes, everything that had happened today was going to matter in a way that no one had planned for. The sky above Red Valley was still flat and bright and indifferent, and somewhere in it, an aircraft was already carrying the first early signs of a problem that nobody on the ground had detected yet. The debrief room at Red Valley held 40 chairs arranged in 4 rows, and by 14:28 it was full. Not just the 32 demonstration pilots. Collins had quietly extended the invitation to Hayes and his senior ground crew to Santos, and 2 of her operations staff, and to 3 senior officers who had been in the VIP viewing area during the afternoon sequence and had separately requested a conversation about what they had watched. The room had the particular density of people who have all witnessed the same thing and are still in the process of deciding what it means. Claire sat in the front row. Not at the presenter's position, Collins had not set up a lectern or a screen or any of the formal infrastructure of a structured briefing. He had arranged the room so that Claire was simply one of the group seated among peers, which was either a subtle courtesy or a deliberate strategic choice, and knowing Collins, it was probably both at once. Ethan sat 2 seats to her right in the same row. Noah sat directly behind her. The room settled. Collins stood at the front, not behind a desk, just standing in the open space at the front of the room, the way he had stood in operational spaces his entire career, with the grounded, unhurried authority of a man who does not need furniture between himself and the people he is talking to. I'm going to start this debrief differently than you're used to, he said. I'm not going to review the sequence card. I'm not going to go through the technical parameters. I'm going to start by asking a question. He paused. What did you watch today? Silence. Not the uncomfortable silence of people who don't have answers. The more interesting silence of people who have answers but are measuring them against each other before committing. Captain Daria Morse spoke first. Tactical flight profile executed in a civilian demonstration context, she said. Military-grade precision, specifically extraction corridor simulation in the second and third segments. Collins nodded. Who else? The energy bleed at low altitude, said a pilot from the third row. That's not in any civilian demonstration handbook. That's in the tactical manual for single pilot extractions in confined spaces. Correct, Collins said. He looked at the room. Anybody want to tell me what that means about the pilot who flew it? Another silence, but shorter this time. She's not a civilian performer, said Calloway from the back. I mean, she is, but she wasn't always. He paused. What she showed us today comes from somewhere specific. It comes from having needed those skills in a real situation. Collins looked at Claire, and the room looked at Claire. She met the collective attention of 40 people without any visible discomfort. She sat straight, hands in her lap, with the same economy of presence she had maintained since 6 that morning. Ms. Morgan, Collins said, I'm going to ask your permission to share some context with this room. You can decline. She considered him for a moment. Share what's relevant, she said. Leave out what isn't. He nodded once. What he shared took 4 minutes. He did not read from the after-action report. He did not cite classification levels or deployment theater names. He spoke in the plain, direct language of a man summarizing an event he had spent 30 years in proximity to, and he gave the room the essential architecture of it: a night extraction, a compromised position, 23 soldiers, two aborted primary attempts, one pilot who made an unauthorized approach in conditions that the weather officer had already marked as unsurvivable, and brought everyone home. He said the call sign, Ghostwriter, and then he sat down. The room was quiet for 11 seconds. Ethan counted them without meaning to. Then a pilot in the second row, a young woman named Lieutenant Grace Park, 25 years old, one of the quietest members of the group all day, said something that was not a question and not a statement, but landed somewhere between the two. She never told anyone, Park said. It was barely above a whisper, but the room was quiet enough that everyone heard it. I told the people who needed to know, Claire said. Her voice was even and clear, not defensive, not emotional. At the time, through the correct channels. She paused. The mission was documented. The record exists. I made a choice about how much of it to carry publicly. A beat. That was my choice to make. Park nodded slowly. She looked like she was doing something difficult inside her own thinking restructuring, something that had been built a particular way and now needed to be rebuilt differently. Ethan leaned forward slightly in his seat. He had something to say, and he was deciding how to say it. He settled on direct. I owe this room an apology, he said. Several people turned to look at him. This morning, he said, in the briefing room, what I said about the call sign, what I implied about who deserved it and who didn't. He looked straight ahead, not at Claire, but at the wall in front of him. The way people look when they're saying something that requires full honesty, and they don't want any social feedback to dilute it while they're getting through it. I made a judgment I had no basis for making. I said it publicly, and I said it loudly, and I said it in front of this room. He paused. I was wrong, not just about her. I was wrong about the way I look at people I don't know. I decided what someone was worth before I knew anything real about them. He stopped. That's a failure. In this job, that kind of failure costs things. I was lucky today that all it cost me was being wrong in front of 40 people. The room was very still. Collins said nothing. He had learned long ago that the most important moments in a room are the ones where a leader's best move is to hold the silence and let it do its work. Ethan finally turned and looked directly at Claire. I apologized to you privately this morning. I'm doing it again here because the public version is the one that matters. Claire looked at him. Thank you, Ethan, she said. It was simple, unhurried, complete. Noah, sitting behind her, exhaled slowly through his nose and looked at his hands. The debrief continued for another 40 minutes, technical questions from the ground crew about the startup sequence, modifications, questions from the pilots about specific maneuver inputs, a sustained conversation between Morse and Claire about the low-altitude segment that became so technically detailed that most of the room simply listened. Claire answered every question with the same straightforward precision she applied to everything. She did not perform humility, and she did not perform authority. She simply knew what she knew and said it clearly, and the room received it in the same spirit. At 15:17, Collins called the debrief to a close. People began to move, gathering notes, pulling phones, breaking into smaller conversations. The room shifted from the focused attention of a formal session to the more open energy of people who have a lot to process and are beginning to find their way into it. Ethan stood up and turned and found Noah directly behind him. Noah looked at him with an expression that was tired in a good way, the tiredness of someone who has done real thinking today and feels it. You okay? Noah asked. I don't know yet, Ethan said. Ask me tomorrow. Noah almost smiled. That's probably the most honest thing you've said all day. Yeah, Ethan said. I know. He looked across the room toward where Claire was now standing with Hayes and Reyes, the three of them deep in a conversation about the aircraft. Reyes asking questions with the focused urgency of a young person who has just discovered a subject they want to know everything about. Hayes listening with the satisfaction of a craftsman watching the next generation find its way towards seriousness. Ethan started toward them. He had almost reached the group when Collins appeared at his shoulder and stopped him with a hand briefly on his arm, not aggressive, just present. Captain, Collins said. Ethan turned. Collins studied him for a moment with the particular measuring attention that very experienced people use when they are assessing something they consider important. What you said in there, Collins said. The apology. Yes, sir. That was not easy, Collins said. Don't let anyone tell you it was easy or that it doesn't matter, because it wasn't and it does. He paused. The hardest thing in this job is not the flying. You know that. The hardest thing is seeing clearly, seeing people clearly, seeing situations clearly, and not letting what you already believe get between you and what is actually there. He looked at Ethan steadily. You had a failure this morning. You corrected it publicly this afternoon. That is the complete sequence of what accountability looks like. You did the whole thing. Ethan said nothing for a moment. She's better than me, he said finally. It came out without drama, without self-pity, without any of the performance register he had been operating in all day. Just a fact stated. Yes, Colin said simply. She is. He paused. That doesn't make you less. It makes you someone who now knows exactly what to work toward. He released Ethan's arm. Go talk to her. Ask real questions. She'll answer them. Ethan nodded. He walked across the room. Claire saw him coming and finished her sentence to Ray as something technical about attitude hold in turbulent conditions at low altitude and turned slightly to include him in the group without making a production of the transition. Can I ask you something? Ethan said. You can ask, she said. And even now, even after everything that had happened today, there was something faintly familiar in those words. The same words she had used that morning when he had asked his first question at the aircraft before he had understood anything. Before the card, before the apology, before the 11 minutes of flying that had rearranged his understanding of what his career was about. He recognized the echo. He thought she might have intended him to. The night mission, he said, 15 years ago. He paused. When you made the approach, when the weather officer had already called it, he held her gaze. What was in your head in that specific moment when you opened the throttle? The room around them had gotten quieter without anyone announcing it. People who had been moving toward the door had slowed. The conversation between Hayes and Reyes had stopped. Noah, 6 feet away, had gone completely still. Claire was quiet for a long moment, not performing the pause, actually thinking, actually going back to that moment and looking at it honestly and deciding how much of the truth was transferable to language and how much would only ever live in the specific memory of it. 23 names, she said finally. Ethan waited. I didn't think about the weather. I didn't think about the protocol. I didn't think about what the weather officer said. She paused. I knew the aircraft. I knew what she could actually give me versus what the parameters said she could give me. And I knew there were 23 people who were going to be alive or not alive based on what I decided in the next 30 seconds. She met his eyes. When it's that clear, it's not courage. It's just math. The math said go. I went. Silence. Then Ethan said, very quietly, that's what courage actually is, isn't it? It's just very clear math. Claire looked at him, and this time, for the first time all day, something in her expression shifted in a direction that was unambiguously warm. Not a full smile, something more contained than that, but real. You're going to be fine, Captain Walker, she said. It was such a simple sentence. 6 words. But it landed in the room like something considerably larger, and several people who heard it looked away for a moment, in the way people look away from things that are true and complete and don't require anything added to them. Outside, the military demonstration sequence was running. The F-35s had been in the air for 40 minutes. The crowd along the perimeter was responding with the full volume enthusiasm of people watching the kind of hardware that is designed specifically to produce that response. Fast, loud, visually spectacular precision engineered to impress. It was impressive. Nobody in the debrief room disputed that. But something had changed in how the pilots who had spent the afternoon in that room were going to watch demonstration flights for the rest of their careers. Something had shifted in the calibration of what they understood impressive to mean, and that shift was going to be permanent in the way that certain lessons are permanent, not because they are dramatic, but because they are true. At 15:41, Ethan's radio crackled. I was still in the debrief room, one of the last 6 people remaining, standing near the back wall with Noah and Morse, when the radio crackled, and the voice on it did something that voices on military radios almost never do. It cracked, not with static, with something human. All ground operations, this is Tower. We have a flight emergency. Shadow 2 is declaring an emergency. Repeat, Shadow 2, Lieutenant Bennett. Noah's head snapped up. That's my call sign, he said. His voice was completely flat with shock. That's my secondary designation. I'm Shadow 2. He looked at his radio. I'm on the ground. I'm standing right here. Ethan was already moving toward the door. Bennett took Shadow 2 for the afternoon rotation because you declined the second slot, he said sharply. Marcus took your designation for the demonstration. Noah stared at him. Lieutenant Kyle Marcus is in Shadow 2, Ethan said. He was through the door. 23 years old, 160 hours. Noah ran. The operations center was 70 meters from the debrief building, and Noah covered it in less time than he had ever covered 70 meters in his life. Behind him, Claire was running too, not in the panicked sprint of someone who doesn't know what they're running toward, but in the controlled, purposeful run of someone who has heard the word emergency on a flight operations radio and already begun processing what the response needs to be. She arrived at the operations center door 4 seconds after Noah, which meant she had been running at almost exactly his pace despite giving away 15 years in the head start. Collins was already at the operations console when they came through the door. The radio traffic was bad. Not in volume, the transmissions were clear. Bad in content. Kyle Marcus, 23 years old, 160 hours, was in an aircraft that had developed a hydraulic failure in the flight control system midway through the demonstration sequence. The failure had not been total. He still had partial control authority. But the partial nature of the failure was in some ways more dangerous than a complete one, because a complete failure has a clear response protocol, and a partial failure requires the pilot to continuously reinterpret which inputs are working and which are not in real time under pressure at speed. Kyle Marcus had 160 hours. He did not have the experience base to manage that reinterpretation process at the speed it required. His transmissions communicated that. Not in the words he chose, his words were professional and controlled, but in the timing between them, the half-second hesitations before responses, the slight over-precision of someone who is working very hard to sound calmer than they are. Tower Shadow 2, I have partial hydraulic failure affecting primary flight controls. Roll authority is degraded approximately 40%. Pitch response is inconsistent. A pause. I am having difficulty holding wings level in the current wind condition. The tower controller responded immediately with the divert to emergency landing protocol. Clear, correct, standard, Marcus responded. He read back the instructions with the half-second hesitations. And Claire, standing behind Collins at the operations console, said very quietly, "He's overcorrecting." Collins turned to look at her. "He's trying to compensate for the roll degradation by over-inputting on the opposite side," as she said. "At 40% degradation, you don't need full opposite input. You need 60% of normal correction. But he doesn't know that because you can't know that without having flown a partial hydraulic failure before." She was already moving toward the communications console. "Who has the frequency?" "Tower has primary," Santos said from the adjacent station. "I need secondary," Claire said. "Emergency backup frequency, direct to the aircraft." Collins looked at her for exactly 1 second. 1 second. Then he turned to Santos. "Give her secondary." Santos was already moving. Noah stood in the middle of the operations center and watched this happen with the particular quality of attention of a person whose body has stopped doing everything except processing the information in front of it. He understood what was happening. He understood what the partial hydraulic failure meant in that aircraft type at that altitude and airspeed. He understood that what Claire had said about overcorrection was correct. He had read the partial failure case studies in his training material, had understood them as theoretical constructs, and was only now watching them become real in a way that theory never fully prepares you for. He understood that Kyle Marcus was in serious danger. And he understood that the person moving toward the communications console was the only person in this building, possibly the only person on this airfield with the specific experiential knowledge to talk him through it correctly. Santos handed Claire the secondary frequency handset. Claire took it. She did not hesitate. She did not take a breath or organize her thoughts or do any of the preliminary things that people do when they are not fully ready. She was fully ready. She had been ready since the moment she heard the radio crackle. "Shadow 2, this is Ghost Rider on secondary emergency frequency. I am a pilot with hydraulic failure experience in your airframe type. I am here to help you. Acknowledge." Static. 2 seconds. 3. "Ghost Rider Shadow 2, I acknowledge." Marcus's voice. Young, controlled on the surface with something working very hard underneath it. I'm having trouble maintaining." "I know," Claire said. Her voice was the same voice she had used in the debrief room. Level, clear, completely unhurried. Not the false calm of someone performing steadiness. The actual calm of someone who has been here before and knows exactly what the next 10 minutes require. Listen to me, Kyle. I need you to do exactly one thing first. Stop trying to hold wings level. A pause. Ma'am, stop trying to hold wings level, she said again in the same tone. At your current degradation level, the control inputs you are making are fighting each other. You are oscillating the aircraft trying to correct the oscillation. I need you to release the correction input and let the aircraft find its own neutral. A pause. Do it now, Kyle. Release. Let her breathe. In the operations center, nobody said anything. Nobody moved except the essential minimum. Collins had both hands on the back of Santos's chair. Noah had pressed himself against the wall with his arms at his sides. Even Hayes, who had arrived at the door 30 seconds earlier, stood completely still. Static. Then Marcus's voice, and in it, something had changed. The half-second hesitation was different. Still there, but different. The quality of the pause had shifted from the hesitation of confusion to the hesitation of someone actually doing something. I released. A breath. The oscillation is it's reducing. Good, Claire said immediately. That's correct. That's what happens. Now listen, your roll authority is degraded 40% on the left side. Your pitch is inconsistent because the hydraulic pressure is variable, not absent. That means you have control. It just requires different inputs than you're used to. Are you with me? With you, Marcus said. Steadier now, slightly. Enough. Your approach is going to feel wrong the entire way down, she said. It is going to feel like you are not in control. You are in control. The sensation is wrong, but the aircraft is responding. It is just responding at a different rate than you expect. I am going to walk you through every input from here to the runway. You do not need to figure anything out. You just need to listen and execute. Can you do that? A pause. Yes, ma'am, Marcus said. And his voice in those two words had found something, not confidence. Exactly, not the learned performance of confidence, but the thing that is underneath confidence when it is real. The thing that says, I am still here, I am still in this aircraft, and I am not alone in it. Collins pressed his hand harder against the back of Santos's chair and said nothing. Claire began. What followed was 12 minutes. 12 minutes of continuous, precise, specific guidance, not general reassurance, not theoretical frameworks, but exact inputs for exact moments. Left roll input at 30%, not 50. Pitch trim adjustment in increments of 2 degrees at a time, not the standard 4. Airspeed management through a profile that accounted for the reduced control authority and the wind condition that had shifted since the morning, and the specific weight configuration of the aircraft as it burned through the fuel it had been carrying for 40 minutes. She gave him numbers. She gave him timing. She told him what the aircraft was going to do before it did it, not because she could see it, but because she had been in that aircraft type with that failure mode in real conditions, and she knew its behavior the way she knew the behavior of everything she had ever flown long enough and honestly enough. Every 30 seconds, she asked him a question, not to check on him emotionally, to check on the aircraft's behavior. She asked about instrument readings, about control response timing, about what he was feeling in the stick. She used his answers to refine the next instruction before he had finished giving her the previous one. She was flying the aircraft with him from the ground. That was the only accurate description of what she was doing. In the operations center, Ethan Walker stood in the doorway. He had arrived 6 minutes in, having run from the perimeter fence when the emergency announcement hit the public address, and he watched Claire at the communications console and felt something move through him that he had no existing category for. I had seen skill today. He had seen mastery. He had spent the morning dismissing it and the afternoon being taught by it, and he had thought he understood the full shape of what he was looking at. He had not. What he was watching now was different from the flying. The flying was mastery of an aircraft. What Claire was doing at this console was mastery of a human being in crisis. The ability to enter the space where another person is most frightened and most alone and most in danger of making the mistakes that fear produces, and to build a structure around them that they can hold on to while they find their way through. That was not a technical skill. That was not something you learned in a cockpit. That was something you built over years of being the person other people depended on in the moments when dependence was not optional. Ethan looked at the radio handset in Claire's hand and thought about the briefing room that morning. the microphone he had picked up, the words he had said into it, the laughter that had followed. And he understood with a clarity that was almost physical what she had meant when she told him that whether he understood why he owed an apology would depend on what he paid attention to this afternoon. She had known, not specifically, not the emergency, but she had known that the afternoon would teach him something the morning had not, because that was the nature of what she knew about pilots and about flying and about the kind of judgment that mattered when things went wrong. She had known, and she had waited, and she had been right. Shadow 2, you are on the extended center line, Claire said into the handset. You are in the correct position. Your altitude is good. Your airspeed is within range. A pause. I need you to breathe right now, Kyle. One full breath, in and out. Do it. A crackle. Then over the radio, audible to everyone in the operations center, the sound of a young pilot taking a full deliberate breath. Good, Claire said. Now listen, the next 60 seconds are the hardest part. Not because the aircraft is going to do anything unexpected. It is going to do exactly what I have told you it will do. Hard because your body is going to tell you to overcorrect when you feel the degraded response. You are going to feel like you're falling even when you're not. I need you to trust the inputs I gave you over your body's reaction. Can you do that for 60 seconds? Yes, ma'am, Marcus said. Then let's bring you home, she said. Noah pressed the back of his hand against his mouth. Collins had his eyes closed. Hayes in the doorway had his hand flat on the doorframe. The radio carried the sound of an aircraft descending toward a runway engine, tone-changing wind noise shifting in the transmission, the background sounds of a cockpit working hard and over all of it. Claire's voice steady and exact and completely present, calling out each phase of the approach in the measured timing of someone who has done this before, in conditions that made this look manageable. Gear down, flaps, final heading correction left 2 degrees, airspeed check, 30 feet, 20, 10. And then the sound that Collins had been waiting for, the particular thud and roll of landing gear meeting runway, the change in engine tone that says on the ground wait, transferred rollout beginning. Brakes, Claire said, normal application, you have runway. The radio carried the sound of deceleration. Carrying Marcus's breathing, steadier now in a different way, not the performed steadiness of the approach, but the shaking release of a person whose body is finally allowed to know that the danger has passed. Tower Shadow 2, Marcus said. I am on the runway, rolling out. Gear is solid. He stopped. His voice had lost its professional control completely, and he didn't try to recover it. I'm okay. I'm okay. The tower controller's response was immediate and warm, in the way that tower controllers are not usually warm. Copy Shadow 2, welcome back. In the operations center, Santos let out a breath that she had apparently been holding for an indeterminate amount of time. Hayes put his forehead briefly against the doorframe. Collins opened his eyes and looked at the ceiling. And Noah Bennett, 26 years old, 840 hours, a good pilot still in the early chapters of understanding what good means. Noah put his hands over his face and stood with his hands over his face for about 5 seconds, and then he lowered them, and his eyes were wet, and he didn't try to hide it or explain it. Claire set the handset down on the console. She turned around. She looked at the room, at Collins, at Santos, at Hayes in the doorway, at Noah, at Ethan standing behind him. Her expression was the same expression it had been all day. Composed, level, steady, the expression of someone who has just done what needed to be done and is now ready to move to whatever comes next. But Ethan, who had been watching her face since the briefing room that morning, saw something he had not seen there before. Something small and brief, the kind of thing you can only see if you have been paying very close attention for a very long time, and he had today finally learned to pay attention in the right way. He saw relief. Not the showy relief of a dramatic moment, the quiet, private relief of a person who has been carrying the weight of someone else's safety and has just been allowed to set it down. She closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. Then she opened them. Someone should send a ground crew to that aircraft, she said. The hydraulic system will need a full inspection before anyone flies it again. There is likely a seal failure in the primary line at the firewall junction. Hayes was already on his radio. Collins looked at her for a long moment. Claire, he said. She looked at him. I didn't have a complete sentence. He was a man who had spent 37 years in a profession that generates moments of genuine extremity and had learned to find language for most of them. But this moment on this afternoon, with this woman in front of him, who had spent a day being laughed at and doubted and dismissed and had responded to all of it by saving a young pilot's life with a radio handset and 12 minutes of irreplaceable experience. This moment was sitting just at the edge of what language could hold. He settled for what was true. "Thank you," he said. Claire held his gaze. "He did the work," she said. "He stayed in the aircraft. He trusted the inputs." She paused. "I just gave him a structure to work inside." Colin shook his head very slightly. "Don't do that," he said. "Don't make it smaller than it was." She looked at him for a moment. And then for the first time all day in front of the people who had watched her fly and watched her guide and watched her carry the weight of an entire day's worth of other people's assumptions in one young pilot's life, Claire Morgan let something rest. Just for a moment. Just long enough to be seen. "Okay," she said quietly. And in that one word, without ceremony or announcement or any of the public architecture of recognition, the day completed itself. Kyle Marcus was still in the aircraft when Claire reached the runway. Nobody had asked her to go. Nobody had directed her toward the emergency landing site or suggested she be part of the ground response team. She had simply set the radio handset down in the operations center, looked at the door, and walked through it with the same unhurried certainty she had used to walk through every door today, and nobody in the room had thought to stop her, because by that point, every person in that building understood without needing to discuss it that Claire Morgan went where she was needed and that arguing with that instinct was approximately as useful as arguing with weather. Hayes fell into step beside her without being asked. Noah followed him. Then Ethan. Then after a moment's pause in the operations center doorway, Collins. The five of them crossed the tarmac toward the runway where Marcus's aircraft had rolled to a stop, and they did it in silence. And the silence was not awkward. It was the silence of people who have been through something together and don't yet have the distance to talk about it accurately. The ground crew had arrived at the aircraft ahead of them. Hayes had gotten them moving the moment Claire set down the handset, and they were positioned around the aircraft with their equipment and their checklists doing the work that needed to be done. Kyle Marcus climbed down from the cockpit on his own. I was 23 years old, and he had 160 hours, and he had just brought an aircraft with a degraded hydraulic system through an emergency approach and landing with a radio voice in his ear that he had never heard before today. And when his boots hit the tarmac, he stood very still for a moment with both hands on the side of the aircraft, and his head down and his shoulders did something that they would not have done if anyone he needed to impress had been watching. They shook, just briefly, just for the few seconds it takes a body to release what it has been holding at maximum compression for 12 minutes. Claire reached him before anyone else did. She didn't say anything immediately. She simply stood beside him, not in front of him, not blocking him, but beside him, and let him have those seconds without making them into a moment that required him to perform recovery for an audience. When his shoulders steadied, she said, "How's your breathing?" He lifted his head and looked at her. His eyes were red at the edges in the way that eyes get when adrenaline clears. "Better," he said. His voice was rougher than it had been on the radio. "A lot better." "Good," she said. "Take 30 more seconds if you need them. The aircraft is not going anywhere." He almost laughed. It came out as something between a laugh and a breath, and it was possibly the most honest sound anyone had made all day. "Yes, ma'am," he said. Ethan arrived and stopped a respectful distance away. He looked at Marcus, really looked at him the way Ethan had been learning to look at people all day. And what he saw was a young pilot who had done something genuinely hard and had done it correctly. And the recognition of that settled into Ethan's chest in a way that had nothing to do with rank or hours or the performance of confidence. "Good landing, Marcus," Ethan said. Marcus looked at him. "Captain Walker." He paused. "I don't—" He stopped. His training told him to say something professional and measured. What came out instead was the truth. "I don't know if I would have gotten it down without—" He looked at Claire. "You got it down," Claire said firmly. Not harshly, with complete conviction. Your hands were on the controls the entire time. Your decision-making held up under real pressure with real consequences. That belongs to you. She held his voice. "Nobody can take that from you. Not even the person on the radio." Marcus looked at her for a long moment. "Who are you?" he asked. He didn't mean it dismissively. He asked it with the genuine, unguarded curiosity of someone who has just been pulled out of dangerous water and wants to understand the hand that reached for them. Claire looked at him. A pilot who's had a bad day in an aircraft before, she said. Marcus stared at her. Then Noah, standing behind Ethan, said very quietly, her call sign is Ghostwriter. Something moved across Marcus's face. He was 23 years old and had 160 hours, but he had been through a complete military aviation education. And there were names in that education that carried specific weight, even to people who had never heard them spoken in a personal context. Ghostwriter was one of those names. It existed in the after-action case study files as a reference without a face attached to it, the way that the most significant entries in those files sometimes exist, documented, completely identified minimally. He looked at Claire with different eyes. The extraction mission, he said. It was barely a sentence. It was more like a breath that had organized itself into words by accident. Claire didn't confirm or deny. She simply held his gaze with the steady attention she gave to everything. Marcus straightened up. I was still shaking slightly, the physical residue of 12 minutes of sustained high-stakes concentration, but he straightened up with the particular dignity of a young person who has just decided that this is a moment that deserves their best posture. Thank you, he said. And he said it the way people say things when they mean them, beyond the ordinary weight of the words, when thank you is carrying more than gratitude, when it is carrying the full weight of what might have happened and didn't. Claire nodded once. Go get your debrief done, she said. Then eat something. Your blood sugar is going to crash in about 20 minutes. Marcus blinked. Then he almost laughed again, for real this time, and the realness of it broke something loose in the tension that had been holding the small group together. And Hayes put his hand briefly on Marcus's shoulder as he passed, and Noah exhaled fully for what felt like the first time in half an hour. Colin stepped forward. He looked at Claire. He looked at the aircraft. He looked at the ground crew doing their work on the hydraulic system with the focused efficiency of people who have been told exactly where to look by a woman who knew the aircraft well enough to diagnose a seal failure from a radio description at distance. The seal failure at the firewall junction, he said to Hayes. Was she right? Hayes was already on his way back from an initial look at the system. He nodded once without stopping. Primary hydraulic line seal firewall junction, exactly where she said. He kept walking. If he'd flown that aircraft another 20 minutes without the guidance, the remaining hydraulic pressure would have dropped below minimum threshold for any meaningful control authority. He disappeared into the ground crew. Colin stood with that information for a moment. Then he turned and looked at Claire with the expression of a man who keeps arriving at the same conclusion from every direction he approaches it. You knew, he said, from the radio description alone, you identified the fault location. It's a known failure mode in that hydraulic configuration under sustained high-G maneuvering, she said. The symptoms he described, the specific combination of roll degradation percentage and pitch inconsistency pattern, match the seal failure profile at that junction. She paused. I've seen it twice before, once in training, once in the field. In the field, Colin said. Yes. He nodded slowly. He didn't ask which field or when or under what circumstances. He had read enough today to understand that those questions had answers that belonged to documents he had already been privileged to read, and that pressing further would be taking something she had not offered. What did you do the 2 times you saw it before? He asked instead. She looked at him. The training incident, the aircraft landed safely. The pilot had the experience to manage it. She paused. The field incident, I was flying the aircraft. Collins went still. I landed it, she said simply. He looked at her for 3 full seconds. Of course you did, he said. At 16:20, the operations center formally stood down the emergency protocol. The runway was cleared. The incident was logged. The standard cascade of administrative processes that follows any flight emergency began its course through the appropriate channels, generating documentation and notifications and review requests that would take weeks to fully resolve. None of that was Claire's concern. She walked back across the tarmac toward the hangar where her aircraft was parked. The Nevada afternoon had reached the point where the heat had peaked and was beginning its slow decline, and the light had shifted from its midday flatness to something with more angle in it, more texture. She didn't hurry. Inside the hangar, she found her aircraft where she had left it, post-flight, settled at rest. She put her hand on the wing root in the same way Hayes had, the way craftsmen touch the things they care for. Not inspection, acknowledgement. She heard footsteps behind her and turned. It was the entire group, not just Ethan and Noah and Collins, all of them. or close to all 26 of the 32 demonstration pilots, plus Hayes and his senior crew, plus Santos, plus Marcus, who had done his immediate debrief in 9 minutes flat and apparently sprinted the rest of the way here. They had come without coordination, without anyone organizing it, without a memo or a directive or a chain of command decision. They had simply independently all decided that they needed to be in this hangar right now. Claire looked at the group looked at her. Nobody seemed entirely sure what was supposed to happen next, which meant this was not a performance. This was people arriving at a place because something pulled them there, and now that they were there, the form of it was entirely uncertain. Collins, who had arrived with the group, but now stepped slightly to the side in the way that experienced leaders step aside when a moment belongs to someone else, simply watched. Ethan stepped forward. I was not comfortable with what he was about to do that was visible. He was a man who was comfortable with many things, but this was not one of the comfortable things, and he didn't pretend otherwise. He stood in front of Claire with his hands at his sides and his face carrying the undisguised effort of a person doing something that matters enough to be difficult. I need to say something, he said, in front of this group. Claire waited. This morning I used a microphone to make you small, he said. In front of everyone here. He paused. I told you earlier that I was sorry. I meant it. But sorry it doesn't cover the full distance. He took a breath. What I did this morning was not just rude, it was a specific kind of failure. I looked at you and I decided what you were worth before I knew anything real about you. I did it fast, and I did it publicly, and I did it confidently, which made it worse because confidence without knowledge is just noise pretending to be signal. He stopped. You spent today being everything I said you weren't, and then you spent 12 minutes keeping a 23-year-old pilot alive with nothing but your voice and your knowledge and 15 years of experience that I spent this morning calling into question. He held her gaze. I will not make that mistake again. Not about you, not about anyone. The hangar was completely quiet. Then Captain Daria Morse began clapping. She began it alone the way she had begun it after the demonstration flight, with the deliberate, unhurried clap of a professional who does not perform appreciation, but who feels it fully when it is warranted. And the group followed her the way genuine responses always follow. Not out of social obligation, not out of reflex, but because the room had reached the point where the appropriate response had become obvious, and the only thing left was to make it. 26 pilots, a chief mechanic and his crew, a lieutenant colonel who had been carefully professional all day and was now clapping with the rest of them, her expression no longer careful in the slightest. And in the doorway, Sergeant Major Robert Collins, who had read a document that morning that changed how he understood his own history, who had spent a day watching a woman carry herself through humiliation and doubt, an emergency with the same unbroken composure Collins, who had stopped being surprised hours ago and still found himself moved, put his hands together. Claire stood in the middle of it. She did not deflect it. She did not wave it away or redirect it to Marcus or tell them it was nothing. Collins had asked her not to make it smaller than it was, and she was honoring that. She stood straight and she received it. And for the second time today in the hangar in front of everyone, something in her expression that had been held very carefully all day was allowed to rest. It was not a performance. It was not a response to the applause. It was what happens to a person's face when they have been carrying something heavy and alone there for a long time, and the people around them finally see it fully, and the seeing of it means they don't have to carry it in the same way anymore. When the applause ended, Marcus appeared at the edge of the group. I was still slightly unsteady. The blood sugar drop Claire had predicted had arrived more or less on schedule, but he pushed through it and came forward until he was standing directly in front of her. Ma'am, he said, I looked up the case study, the extraction mission. He paused. It's in our training files. I've read it twice. I didn't know the pilot's name. He stopped. I know it now. Claire looked at him. The case study saved your life today, she said quietly. Not me. You knew the protocols. You stayed in the aircraft. You listened. That's what the case study was written to teach, and you had actually learned it. She held his gaze. Most people read case studies like history. You flew today like someone who understood they might need it. Marcus stared at her. I had no idea I was going to need it, he said honestly. Nobody ever does, she said. That's why we prepare. He nodded slowly. And then he did something that surprised even him. He extended his hand. She took. The handshake was brief and firm, and it carried in its brevity everything that a longer gesture could not have held as cleanly. The group began to move conversations, starting the natural dissolution of a moment into the human activity that follows moments. Hayes went back to his aircraft inspection. Santos drifted toward the door, her radio active again, with the administrative cascade of the emergency response. The pilots began finding each other in small groups, talking in the tone people use when they are processing something that is going to take longer to fully understand than they currently have time for. Noah found Claire near the wing of her aircraft. He had been waiting for the room to clear slightly with the particular patience of a person who has something specific to say and wants to say it in the right space. "Can I ask you something?" he said. She turned. "You can ask." He recognized the phrase. She saw that he recognized it. Neither of them commented on it. "After today," he said, "after everything, are you going to come back to events like this?" He paused. "To rooms like the one this morning?" She considered the question seriously. "Yes," she said. Why?" he asked, not challenging, genuinely asking. She was quiet for a moment. "Because Kyle Marcus is 23 years old and has 160 hours, she said. "And Reyes is 22 and asks the right questions. And you are 26 and you just spent a day learning things that are going to make you a better pilot for the next 40 years. She paused. "Because rooms like the one this morning need people who have been through the whole thing and came out the other side, not to be applauded, not to be recognized." She met his eyes. "To be useful." Noah looked at her. "Even when rooms like the one this morning start the way this one did?" he asked quietly. "Especially then," she said. He nodded. Then he said the thing he had been working up to since he first walked over. "I'm going to be a better pilot because of today. I want you to know I understand that. Not just because of the flying or the emergency, because of how you handled every part of it." He paused. "Including how you handled us." Claire looked at him steadily. "You handled yourself," she said. "I just showed up." He smiled at that. A real smile, not performed, not social. The smile of a person who has been given a generous answer and knows it and appreciates it and is willing to let it stand even while understanding it is generous. "Yes, ma'am," he said. He stepped back. Ethan was waiting near the hangar entrance. When Claire walked toward the door, he fell into step beside her, not blocking her path, just walking with her the way people walk with each other when they have covered difficult ground together, and the conversation is winding toward its natural end. They walked in silence for a moment. Then Ethan said, "What did you write in your notebook this morning in the briefing room after I—" He stopped. "After the laugh." She glanced at him. "A note," she said. "About what?" She was quiet for a step or two. "About the wind direction," she said. It had shifted overnight from the forecast. "I wanted to remember to check the updated reading before I flew." Ethan stared at the middle distance for a moment. He had spent half the day constructing explanations for that notation, had imagined she was writing about him, about the humiliation, about the injustice of the moment. Had assigned in the notebook entry the weight of a private response to everything he had just subjected her to. And she had been writing about the wind. Because she was a pilot, and a pilot's first attention goes to the aircraft and the conditions, and whatever happened in rooms with microphones was not the thing that required immediate notation. He let out a slow breath. "You really didn't need any of us to see it," he said. "Did you? What you are, what you've done, you genuinely didn't need that." She walked 2 steps before answering. "No," she said. "Then why?" He stopped himself, started differently. "What made you willing to be here today? In a room like that one, knowing it was probably going to go the way it went?" She stopped walking. She turned and looked at him, the full, direct, unhurried attention that she had been giving things all day. The attention that did not perform, and did not manage, and did not give you anything except the honest weight of being fully seen in return. "Because Marcus needed to be here today," she said. "And Park needed to be here. And Reyes. And you." She paused. "And the only way I could be useful in the afternoon was to be present in the morning. Even the morning that happened." Ethan held her gaze. "Even the morning that happened," he repeated. "The hard mornings are part of the job," she said simply. "I learned that a long time ago." She started walking again. He walked beside her to the hangar entrance, and there they stopped because her path continued toward the parking area and his continued back toward the operations center and the natural geography of the day was bringing things to their close. Ghostwriter, he said. She looked at him. It fits, he said. I understand that now. He paused. I'm sorry it took me until the end of the day to say something true. She looked at him for a moment longer. Most people take longer, she said. We'll never get there. She held his gaze. You got there. She turned and walked toward her vehicle. He watched her go. At 17:10, Collins found Claire in the parking area loading her flight bag into the back of her truck with the economy of movement that defined everything she did. He arrived without ceremony and stood near the tailgate and waited for her to finish. She closed the tailgate and turned. They stood in the fading Nevada afternoon and looked at each other, and between them was the full weight of a day that neither of them had expected to go the way it went. I need to tell you something, Collins said. She waited. 15 years ago, he said, when your mission was filed, when the after-action report was written, he paused. There were people in my command who knew the call sign, who knew what happened that night, who spent years wanting to find the pilot behind it and make sure she was recognized the way she should have been recognized. Claire said nothing. I was one of those people, Collins said. She looked at him steadily. I know, she said quietly. He studied her face. You knew I would look for you eventually. I knew someone would, she said. I didn't know when. I didn't know where. She paused. I decided a long time ago that when it happened, I would let it happen without running from it, but also without making it into something larger than it was. She met his eyes. What happened that night was not larger than 23 people getting home. I would like it to stay exactly that size. Collins felt something move through him that he had been managing at a careful distance all day. The grief and gratitude and relief of a man who has spent 15 years carrying a debt that he could not find the address to deliver. That size, he said carefully, saved real lives, real families, real futures. He paused. Marcus's family has no idea how close they came today to a different kind of phone call. He doesn't fully know yet either. But I know, because I've made that kind of call, Claire. I've stood in front of families and delivered the other version. His voice was steady, but the steadiness was working. You gave them the right version, both times. She held his gaze without looking away. I did what the situation required, she said. Yes, he said. You did, with everything you had, both times. He paused. I want you to hear this from someone who has the full picture. What you did 15 years ago and today, those are not separate stories. They are the same story. The story of a pilot who shows up and does what is needed and asks nothing in return. He paused one final time. That story deserves to be known. Claire was quiet for a long moment. The parking area around them was emptying. The last light of the afternoon was long and angular across the tarmac. Somewhere behind them in the hangar, Hayes and his crew were deep into the hydraulic inspection. The military demonstration sequence had concluded. The crowd was gone, the cameras were packed. The day was almost done. Tell it then, she said finally. If it helps someone, if it teaches something, tell it. She paused. Just tell it right. Collins nodded. They stood in the parking lot for one more moment, two people who had found each other at the end of a 15-year accounting, standing in the ordinary light of an ordinary Nevada afternoon with the full weight of an extraordinary day between them. Then she got into her truck. He stepped back. She started the engine. And before she pulled out, she looked at him through the window. One last, clear, direct look, the same look she had been giving to things all day. The look that did not perform and did not manage and gave you only honesty in return. He raised his hand. She drove. Collins stood in the parking lot and watched the truck move toward the gate, and he stayed there until it turned onto the access road and disappeared from his line of sight. And even then he stood for another moment in the particular stillness of a man who has just witnessed the end of something that took 15 years to finish. Behind him inside the operations center, he knew the paperwork was accumulating. The incident reports, the emergency logs, the sequence of administrative decisions that would generate their own documentation trails and review processes and official determinations. None of them would capture what had happened today. Not fully, not accurately, not in the way that mattered. What had happened today was not capturable in official language. It lived in the specific weight of Marcus's breath over the emergency radio when the oscillation steadied. It lived in the expression on Ethan Walker's face when he finally understood what he was looking at. It lived in the sound of 26 pilots clapping in a hangar, not because they were told to, not because it was expected, but because genuine recognition, the kind that comes from actually seeing someone, clearly demands to be expressed in some form, and applause was the form available. It lived in a worn, laminated card carried for 15 years in a flight bag with a call sign printed in capital letters. Ghost Rider, a name that had been laughed at in the morning, a name that by the end of the afternoon would never be laughed at again by anyone who had been present at Red Valley Air Force Base on this particular day in Nevada. Not because the laugh had been corrected, not because the record had been officially announced or the recognition formally conferred, but because 32 pilots had watched the truth demonstrate itself at altitude and at a radio handset in a sequence of events that required nothing from anyone except the willingness to pay attention, and had found, when they paid attention, that the truth was exactly as large as it had always been. It had simply been waiting with the particular patience of things that do not need to announce themselves for the right afternoon to show its full shape. Ghost Rider had been here all along, and now everyone who mattered knew exactly what that name was worth.